Welcome to part 2, Muslim Apologetics Australia. We're discussing the evidence to prove that the crucifixion of Jesus killed did not actually occur as it appears in the Bible. So, continuing on, we're looking now at the evidence. Remember in part 1 we're speaking about the disguise. Jesus can supernaturally prevent himself from being recognized. And this is the quote. It's from gotquestions.org. This is a Christian apologetics fatwa website. You can go to it, done by prominent Christians. And if you go below the page, they actually discuss how Jesus, after the resurrection, he was basically in hiding. And some of his early disciples could not actually recognize Jesus. And look what they say. They say, Jesus, until he broke the bread, and it says, how could these two disciples have walked, talked, and eaten with Jesus without recognizing him? In this instance, it seems that they were, listen, look what it says. It says they were supernaturally prevented from recognizing Jesus. They say further, Jesus perhaps had taken on a different appearance to keep himself from being recognized. So notice, look at what the Christian fatwa website is saying. They're proving how Jesus hid himself even though he was talking to the disciples. He was hiding himself because he could supernaturally prevent anyone from recognizing him by changing a different appearance. And the link of this Christian apologetic fatwa website will be published below this video. You can go and read it for yourself. I'm not making this up. You can go and read verbatim for what it says. So there you have it, folks. We have now Christian fatwa websites saying that Jesus, by a miracle, can supernaturally prevent anyone seeing him and so forth. And he can change his appearance. So why is it now illogical that Jesus could if he can change his own appearance, he could also change someone else's appearance and make that person look like Jesus and go out and be martyred instead of Jesus? And we know that the Quran and the Hadith say that it was made to appear, and even in the Hadith it is mentioned in those narrations that Jesus, according to Islam, that he asked one of his disciples who would want to take his position to be martyred while to fool the enemies thinking that they killed Jesus Christ. So this is actually mentioned in the Islamic literature. And now we have it confirmed in the fatwa websites of Christians who are saying Jesus has power to do this. So, when Christians say, Islam is illogical, Islam has no evidence, Islam doesn't have any historical statements to defend this position, there you have it. What's so irrational or what's so illogical about Jesus performing these miracles? Your Christian fatwa websites are saying that he could supernaturally change his appearance. And as you know, we can go back to the same story where Christians say, there was a witness, that was the disciple who was in a distance. And notice when you go to the earliest Gospels, it says that they were in a distance, but then John, the Gospel of John that came later, it tries to portray how they came to the foot of the cross like Mary Magdalene. But again, remember in the first part of this video, we quoted clearly to say that Jesus was so disfigured. So if he was disfigured so badly in his face, then even if his mother stood in front of the cross, she couldn't have recognized him. And like I said, even if she did recognize him and claimed it was Jesus, again, Jesus can supernaturally put his own figure on someone else. So it doesn't prove a case to say, there were witnesses on the cross and so forth. And remember, when they went to the tomb was already moved, the rock was already moved, and Jesus was standing there. It wasn't like they actually saw him resurrect. He was standing there next to the cross. And of course, the original body, that took Jesus' place, Jesus could have hid that away They could have moved it away. The angels could have moved it away because the angels were present there as well. So, as you can see, Jesus could have removed that body, and he could have then later on showed himself to the disciples. And of course, we've already gone through the episode where the disciples thought they saw a spook, and Jesus tried to comfort them to say that, a spirit doesn't have flesh and bones, and he ate with them to prove that he didn't die. And even if Christians want to refer to the disciples as evidence and proof and so forth, we can't use this as evidence. That is kind of objectionable, since Jesus was meant to be prophesied, but they simply can't work out who he is. These disciples were a little bit stupid. They couldn't really work out who he is. Sure, I'll give that. Some Christians say they didn't know Jesus up until his appearance. But what about when we actually quote verses 20? This is in John chapter 20, verse 9. Jesus was to be crucified, which proves that they can't be trusted. Because in this verse, it says that the disciples could not even understand Jesus in verse 20 to 9 in John. Jesus also had disciples of him to reject Judas. Judas, for example, rejected Jesus. So you can see clearly that the disciples can't be trusted here. And Peter at one time was even called a Satan by Jesus, according to the New Testament. So I don't think they could be trusted much, since all of them forsaked him and fled prior to the crucifixion. And the other one that he loved can't even be confirmed by name. So you have no disciple eyewitness to the crucifixion. They can't be trusted. Disciples like John the Baptist or Peter, who Jesus said his church is built upon, was not there as an eyewitness even at the crucifixion. Mary Magdalene, who was present, could not seem to work out who Jesus was after the crucifixion. She knew who Jesus was prior to the crucifixion, yet she had trouble identifying him when Jesus was dressed as a gardener. More proof Jesus was hiding all along, and his mother Mary was far away when the crucifixion happened, but came close in the later Gospels. Again, what she saw could have been the disfigured face of Jesus, thinking it was her son. And even if you dismiss and ignore it all and claim it's sufficient eyewitness, still does not dismiss God is unable to delude all their eyes intended to delude the enemies, thinking it was Jesus. It seems that John's gospel is making it up as it goes, because the earliest gospels don't mention Mary at the feet of the cross. And again, we can say the further away from the date, the less authentic. John happens to be last of the four gospels, therefore it had to be less authentic, since it's based on not the writings of an eyewitness account, rather hearsay. Christians say, why do Muslims dismiss the Gospel of John if it's a prophecy of the Prophet Muhammad? This is the illogical arguments they come up with. And the simple answer to that is, I agree. I really don't have to use it. The Quran is sufficient. But let's hope you stick to that same token. Also, will you dismiss Jesus' resurrection, proof for the eyewitness evidences, because it's not mentioned in the earliest of the four Gospels? The disciples witnessed a resurrection. In Mark's Gospel, it says risen, but does not mention the eyewitness disciple. That comes in a later Gospel to improve the story. Just like when Luke's Gospel mentions all the disciples witnessed the resurrection except for doubting Thomas. Then the story gets improved in John's Gospel, saying that Jesus appeared and went after Thomas to prove a resurrection. Notice the story keeps getting corrected. It pretty much is a snowball effect. The later you go, the more added information to prove something that wasn't there from the beginning. In fact, even the divinity has evolved in the same way. The earliest Gospels does not mention the Trinity, like the Gospel of Mark or Luke. It comes later in Matthew and John's narration. And most verses on the divinity are expressed in the later Gospel of John as opposed to Mark, Luke's, or Matthew's. That's why you'll find Christian missionaries quoting more from the Gospel of John for the divinity of Jesus than the others. So it's all a snowball effect. It's clear that this was evolved. It was a story that wasn't adding up. They didn't have much proof and evidence for Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection and so forth, but they continuously added information as they kept going to make their case stronger. And that's what Christian missionaries are trying to present today, not from the earliest, but from the later of the Gospels, trying to put emphasis that there were eyewitnesses, it was sufficient, they came close to the cross and so forth. This was a later invention. It's interesting because Christians bring up, they say a Roman soldier speared Jesus, to prove that he really did die on the cross. But like we quoted earlier, some Muslims get into the discussion of, water came out before blood and all this, blah, blah, blah. You don't have to get into that because we know clearly that Jesus can change his appearance and his image, and another man simply got killed on the cross. That's simple. And, Jesus even said, my God, why have you forsaken me? I mean, if this was really Jesus on the cross, why is he making those statements? If Jesus really came to die for your sins, then he should have accepted that. But for the fact that he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? It shows that another person was put in his place, being a martyr. Because Jesus, if he was really doing the will of God, he would not utter such a statement. He would be silent, just like Isaac was silent when Abraham was going to sacrifice him. And it's a dilemma. And if it was really Jesus, again, it doesn't prove salvation and crucifixion and Jesus wanting to die for your sin, because it's clear that the man is condemning being killed and is crying why his God forsaked him. So it's just a double dilemma. And I know Christians want to use an old prophecy to say, that was an old prophecy being fulfilled. Well, thank you if you're trying to prove an old prophecy being fulfilled, because the same words are found in the Old Testament. It just proves that the Old Testament also condemns him not to be killed and condemns against any such killing. In this discussion, I could use many other evidences, such as where Jesus told his disciples to buy swords to protect him against anyone trying to come and capture him to be crucified. But I'm not going to go into that in this video because I've already made a video on the absurdities of the crucifixion narrative, and that's in a separate section. So go and watch that video. You'll find it very fascinating, and you'll see the absurdities leading up to the crucifixion, where this man Jesus did not even want to be killed. And in that, you'll also see where Jesus asked for the cup to be passed, and he said, not my will, but your will be done. And the Gospel of John tried to actually correct this, to say, no, Jesus was willing. It was another narrative that was made up later on. It wasn't like that in the earliest Gospel. So please watch that video besides this. This is interesting. You've probably seen this video in the screen. It's posted by Ratio Christie. It says, a real-life cold case detective and an author of Cold Case Christianity, Christian apologist J. Warner Wallace is featured in God's Not Dead 2 courtroom scene. And what Christian apologists do is they refer to this man to say that this man is an investigator. He's a forensic expert who has proven a lot of cases in the courtroom. And they're trying to use his expertise in today's real world. And it really fascinates me to say that this Christian apologist can scrutinize the evidence in the Bible and can prove not only the death of Jesus Christ, but he can also prove a resurrected Christ. Why? Simply because he's an investigator in Christian apologists, and he's also investigator in the real world. He's a prosecutor. He's a forensic detective, basically. But when we actually scrutinize J. Warner Wallace's work, what does he actually investigate? I mean, you can't actually prove a resurrected Christ in a courtroom, can you? That requires faith. You can't go back 2,000 years ago and try and prove a miracle today. Now, I'm not saying that this argument can't be made against Islam, right? It could. But I want Christians to show some consistency. See, I as a Muslim wouldn't be making silly arguments like that. Let's say, for example, the Prophet Muhammad, he split the moon, and let's say his companions saw this, and there is hadith to say that companions did witness him in Sahih al-Bukhari, and I can post a link and the source below this video to prove it. Can you imagine I am Ahmed and I'm a lawyer and I've got a good prosecution record to prove cases? Can you imagine I say I looked into the Quranic literature and I looked into all the evidence and I looked into all the eyewitness accounts, and I can tell you now as an expert in the field of investigation and forensic evidence that the Prophet Muhammad was telling the truth when he said he split the moon and his companions saw that? Would any Christian apologist take me seriously? Would they even consider that as evidence? Well, maybe they would, if they want to be consistent and want me to accept J. Warner Wallace as a forensic expert on Christianity. What I'm merely showing is that some miracles at the time remain miracles at the time. Okay, you don't go and use a forensic expert today to prove a case. You can't 100% prove it. That's the point I'm making. And even a Christian whose name is Brandon Bales, he actually writes to me in the same post because we had a bit of an exchange, and he says, nothing can be proven 100%. He said, not a religion, not a murder, certainly not an existence of a 7th century fraud who has called himself a prophet. He's referring to the prophet. So you see, the Christian doesn't get it, but as a Muslim, I'm not making the claim that we can forensically prove the splitting of the moon, right? But you Christians are trying to make a forensic analysis to prove that Jesus rose from the dead. And what I'm merely saying is that you can't prove it, right? You can't prove it in a courtroom. There may be probabilities of it happening, but you can't 100% prove it. You could have a jury system that votes against it if you can't 100% prove it. So when Christians refer to J. Warner as a forensic analysis to prove these events, it doesn't merely work. And even Christian apologists like even Nick Peters above, I think he even admits that you can't actually prove it 100%. So I don't know why Christian apologists refer to such experts. It just merely amazes me. Earlier in the video, we proved that Allah, in his intention was only to fool the enemies of Jesus Christ, not the actual believers. Here are some additional evidences that even the biblical God, according to the Bible, actually shows people some strong delusions. Have a look at this. It says, this is in 2 Thessalonians 2:11 ESV version. It says, therefore God sends them a strong delusion so that they may believe what is false. The Lord confuses the wicked. Confound their words, for I see violence and I strive in the city. This is Psalms 55 verses 9. And it continues and says, but the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and he did not listen to them, as the Lord had spoken to Moses. Exodus 9:12. So then he has mercy on whoever he wills, and he hardens whoever he wills. Romans 9:8. So as you can clearly see, even the Bible testifies that God sends a strong delusion to his enemies. And this is clearly a prophecy that was fulfilled in the New Testament, where God sent a strong delusion to his enemies, specifically in thinking that they killed and crucified Christ. Now, if Christians want to go ahead later on and start writing things based on that, that's not Yahweh's fault or God's fault. That's the Christians who have become misguided in also believing in what God did by fooling his enemies. That's not God's fault. That's just their ignorance for following misguidance. Earlier we quoted the Gnostic Gospels, and here is another argument they make. They say, they get so frustrated, they say, oh, the Quran actually copied other ancient texts, that Jesus did not die. So like I said, you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. They love saying to Muslims, oh, we don't accept the Quran, it came 600 years later. We want to accept something earlier, and when you quote something earlier, then they say the Quran copied it. So it's you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Which one is it? I mean, if we bring the evidence from earlier, you say we copied it. If we don't bring it, you say, well, we can't trust the Quran. Amazing hypocrisy and double standards. And here's another really good question raised for those who have a problem with a 600-year confirmation. The Prophet of Islam, Allah came 600 years. Why should we believe that? This is a question for the Christians raised by my dear Muslim brother called Mustafa Ahmed. He says, question for Christians. They say the Jews got it wrong. They mistranslated the Old Testament and therefore couldn't see where the Messiah was. If it took over 2,000 years for Jesus to come and correct the Old Testament, why do they complain if 600 years later the Quran came and corrected both the Old and the New Testament? Amazing double standards, isn't it? And here is the interesting thing. Why did it, the New Testament was revealed 2,000 years ago, yet it took another 2,000 years later where Christians now are coming up and trying to correct the New Testament. For example, when you go read what Christian apologist David Wood says and Dr. James White, they say that the last 12 verses of Mark's Gospel is not authentic. So we have Christian scholars now, or apologists, correcting their Bibles today, and it's been nearly 2,000 years, yet they have a problem with the Quran correcting the Christian mythologies 600 years later. Double standards or what? And of course, these people treat the Quran as if it was, a man was just walking around claiming he had inspiration and he was writing as some witness. The Quran is not doing that. The Quran is a separate revelation coming from God. So it doesn't matter if it came 200 years later, or it doesn't matter if it came 5,000 years later. It's the Word of God. The Word of God doesn't have a time. Truth, no matter how far it is in the timeline. These silly Christians conflate the Quran, a direct revelation from God, completely inspired, to some scribes writing and narrating what they heard from the first of the eyewitnesses, as Luke 1:1 claims. That's totally different. Remember earlier we were mentioning how the Gospels in the earlier do not mention some of these key facts about the evidence for the crucifixion or the evidences for the resurrection and so forth, and some of the improvements and evolvements. I know you're probably asking yourself, well, can you actually show us an example of that? So I'll give you 2 or 3 references. What do the 4 Gospels say about Jesus being killed by a cross, or by a spear actually, right? When the Roman soldier came and put the spear into him. Well, surprisingly, Mark, Luke, Matthew's Gospel do not make any mention of that. The only mention comes from the last Gospel, which is Gospel of John 19, verses 19 to 34. It mentions this. So notice you can't simply die from being crucified for a few hours on the cross. The last Gospel wanted to ensure that Jesus was confidently killed. So you can clearly see that they were trying to prove later on that Jesus was killed. But those Gospels don't say that. And I don't even have to get into this, but I'm doing it for the sake of it anyway. But like I said, even if it is proof that he did die and he was really speared and the man really died, we could just simply say it was someone else. And we've discussed that earlier, showing you proof and evidence for that. And we can even see the improvements of a willing Jesus for the crucifixion improved. In Luke 22:42, it says Jesus prays to the Father to remove the cup. But the same event, it comes in a later gospel, in the Gospel of John. It says Jesus confidently comes out to do the will of the Father. So you see how the narrative just changes from a non-willingness Jesus to a willingness Jesus. Who witnessed the resurrection story? Mark's Gospel, no mention in the earliest. All it says he was risen. It doesn't mention anything about who witnessed it. But it does in the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of John. So the narrative improves. I've even seen some silly Christian missionaries who try and say, oh, your Quran even proves that Jesus dies. But then I ask the Christians, where did Jesus die exactly? Which place? Like on the cross, or he fell off a horse? You watch them run, because in Quran 4 verses 157, it says Jesus was neither killed nor crucified. So who can actually explain that? These Christian missionaries bring up Surah